Chapter 2. In which little Gavroche extracts profit from Napoleon the Great. Spring in Paris is often traversed by harsh and piercing breezes which do not precisely chill but freeze one. These north winds which sadden the most beautiful days produce exactly the effect of those puffs of cold air which enter a warm room through the cracks of a badly fitting door or window. It seems as though the gloomy door of winter had remained ajar, and as though the wind were pouring through it. In the spring of 1832, the epoch when the first great epidemic of this century broke out in Europe, these north gales were more harsh and piercing than ever. It was a door even more glacial than that of winter which was ajar. It was the door of the sepulchre. In these winds one felt the breath of the cholera. From a meteorological point of view, these cold winds possessed this peculiarity, that they did not preclude a strong electric tension. Frequent storms, accompanied by thunder and lightning, burst forth at this epoch. One evening, when these gales were blowing rudely, to such a degree that January seemed to have returned and that the bourgeois had resumed the cloaks, little Gavroche, who was always shivering gaily under his rags, was standing as though in ecstasy before a wigmaker's shop in the vicinity of the Orme Saint-Gervais. He was adorned with a woman's woolen shawl, picked up no one knows where, and which he had converted into a neck comforter. Little Gavroche appeared to be engaged in intent admiration of a wax bride, in a low-necked dress, and crowned with orange flowers, who was revolving in the window, and displaying her smile to passers-by, between two argand lamps. But in reality, he was taking an observation of the shop, in order to discover whether he could not prig from the shop front a cake of soap, which he would then proceed to sell for a sou to a hairdresser in the suburbs. He had often managed to breakfast off of such a roll. He called his species of work, for which he possessed special aptitude, shaving barbers. While contemplating the bride, and eyeing the cake of soap, he muttered between his teeth, "Tuesday. It was not Tuesday. Was it Tuesday? Perhaps it was Tuesday. Yes, it was Tuesday." No one has ever discovered to what this monologue referred. Yes, perchance, this monologue had some connection with the last occasion on which he had dined, 3 days before, for it was now Friday. The barber in his shop, which was warmed by a good stove, was shaving a customer and casting a glance from time to time at the enemy, that freezing and impudent street urchin, both of whose hands were in his pockets, but whose mind was evidently unsheathed. While Gavroche was scrutinizing the shop window and the cakes of Windsor soap, 2 children of unequal stature, very neatly dressed, and still smaller than himself, one apparently about 7 years of age, the other 5, timidly turned the handle and entered the shop, with a request for something or other, alms possibly, in a plaintive murmur which resembled a groan rather than a prayer. They both spoke at once, and their words were unintelligible because sobs broke the voice of the younger, and the teeth of the elder were chattering with cold. The barber wheeled round with a furious look, and without abandoning his razor, thrust back the elder with his left hand and the younger with his knee, and slammed his door, saying, "The idea of coming in and freezing everybody for nothing." The 2 children resumed their march in tears. In the meantime, a cloud had risen. It had begun to rain. Little Gavroche ran after them and accosted them. "What's the matter with you, brats?" "We don't know where we are to sleep," replied the elder. "Is that all?" said Gavroche. "A great matter, truly. The idea of bawling about that. They must be greenies." And adopting, in addition to his superiority, which was rather bantering, an accent of tender authority and gentle patronage. "Come along with me, young uns." "Yes, sir," said the elder. And the two children followed him as they would have followed an archbishop. They had stopped crying. Gavroche led him up the Rue Saint-Antoine in the direction of the Bastille. As Gavroche walked along, he cast an indignant backward glance at the barber's shop. "That fellow has no heart, the whiting, 35," he muttered. "He's an Englishman." A woman who caught sight of these three marching in a file, with Gavroche at their head, burst into noisy laughter. This laugh was wanting in respect towards the group. "Good day, Mademoiselle Omnibus," said Gavroche to her. An instant later, the wig-maker occurred to his mind once more, and he added, "I am making a mistake in the beast. He's not a whiting, he's a serpent. Barber, I'll go and fetch a locksmith, and I'll have a bell hung to your tail." This wig-maker had rendered him aggressive. As he strode over a gutter, he apostrophized a bearded portress who was worthy to meet Faust on the Brocken, and who had a broom in her hand. "Madam," said he, "so you are going out with your horse?" And thereupon, he spatted the polished boots of a pedestrian. "You scamp!" shouted the furious pedestrian. Gavroche elevated his nose above his shawl. "Is monsieur complaining?" "Of you," ejaculated the man. "The office is closed," said Gavroche. "I do not receive any more complaints." In the meanwhile, as he went on up the street, he perceived a beggar girl, 13 or 14 years old, and clad in so short a gown that her knees were visible, lying thoroughly chilled under a porte-coqueret. The little girl was getting to be too old for such a thing. Growth does play these tricks. The petticoat becomes short at the moment when nudity becomes indecent. "Poor girl," said Gavroche. "She hasn't even trousers. Hold on, take this." And unwinding all the comfortable woolen which he had around his neck, he flung it on the thin and purple shoulders of the beggar girl, where the scarf became a shawl once more. The child stared at him in astonishment, and received the shawl in silence. When a certain stage of distress has been reached in his misery, the poor man no longer groans over evil, no longer returns thanks for good. "That done." "Bruh," said Gavroche, who was shivering more than St. Martin, for the latter retained one half of his cloak. At this bruh, the downpour of rain, redoubled in its spite, became furious. The wicked skies punish good deeds. "Ah, come now," exclaimed Gavroche. "What's the meaning of this? It's raining. Good heavens, if it goes on like this, I shall stop my subscription." And he set out on the march once more. "It's all right," he resumed, casting a glance at the beggar girl, as she coiled up under the shawl, "she's got a famous peel." And looking up at the clouds he exclaimed, "Caught." The two children followed close on his heels. As they were passing one of these heavy grated lattices, which indicate a baker's shop, for bread is put behind bars like gold, Gavroche turned round. "Ah, by the way, brats, have we dined?" "Monsieur," replied the elder, "we have had nothing to eat since this morning." "So you have neither father nor mother?" resumed Gavroche majestically. "Excuse us, sir, we have a papa and a mamma, but we don't know where they are." "Sometimes that's better than knowing where they are," said Gavroche, who was a thinker. "We have been wandering about these 2 hours," continued the elder. "We have hunted for things at the corners of the streets, but we have found nothing." "I know," ejaculated Gavroche, "it's the dogs who eat everything." He went on, after a pause. "Ah, we have lost our authors. We don't know what we have done with them. This should not be, Gaimons. It's stupid to let old people stray off like that. Come now. We must have a snooze all the same." However, he asked them no questions. What was more simple than that they should have no dwelling place? The elder of the two children, who had almost entirely recovered the prompt heedlessness of childhood, uttered this exclamation. It's queer, all the same. Mama told us that she would take us to get a blessed spray on Palm Sunday. Bosh, said Gavroche. Mama, resumed the elder, is a lady who lives with Mamselle Miss Tanflute, retorted Gavroche. Meanwhile he had halted, and for the last 2 minutes he had been feeling and fumbling in all sorts of nooks which his rags contained. At last he tossed his head with an air intended to be merely satisfied, but which was triumphant, in reality. Let us be calm, young uns. Here's supper for 3. And from one of his pockets he drew forth a sou. Without allowing the 2 urchins time for amazement, he pushed both of them before him into the baker's shop, and flung his sou on the counter, crying, "Boy! 5 centimes worth of bread." The baker, who was the proprietor in person, took up a loaf and a knife. "In 3 pieces, my boy," went on Gavroche. And he added with dignity, "There are 3 of us." And seeing that the baker, after scrutinizing the 3 customers, had taken down a black loaf, he thrust his finger far up his nose with an inhalation as imperious as though he had had a pinch of the great Frederick's snuff on the tip of his thumb, and hurled this indignant apostrophe full in the baker's face. "Keksekça." Those of our readers who might be tempted to espy in this interpellation of Gavroche's to the baker a Russian or a Polish word, or one of those savage cries which the yoways and the botocudos hurl at each other from bank to bank of a river, athwart the solitudes, are warned that it is a word which they, our readers, utter every day, and which takes the place of the phrase qu'est-ce, cela. The baker understood perfectly, and replied, "Well, it's bread, and very good bread of the second quality." "You mean Latin brutal black bread?" Retorted Gavroche, calmly and coldly disdainful. "White bread, boy. White bread. Latin savane!" I'm standing treat. The baker could not repress a smile, and as he cut the white bread he surveyed them in a compassionate way which shocked Gavroche. "Come, now, baker's boy," said he, "what are you taking our measure like that for?" All 3 of them placed end to end would have hardly made a measure. When the bread was cut, the baker threw the sou into his drawer, and Gavroche said to the 2 children, "Grub away." The little boys stared at him in surprise. Gavroche began to laugh. "Ah! Hello, that's so. They don't understand yet, they're too small." And he repeated, "Eat away." At the same time, he held out a piece of bread to each of them. And thinking that the elder, who seemed to him the more worthy of his conversation, deserved some special encouragement and ought to be relieved from all hesitation to satisfy his appetite, he added, as he handed him the largest share, "Ram that into your muzzle." One piece was smaller than the others. He kept this for himself. The poor children, including Gavroche, were famished. As they tore their bread apart in big mouthfuls, they blocked up the shop of the baker, who, now that they had paid their money, looked angrily at them. "Let's go into the street again," said Gavroche. They set off once more in the direction of the Bastille. From time to time, as they passed the lighted shop windows, the smallest halted to look at the time on a leaden watch which was suspended from his neck by a cord. "Well, he is a very green un," said Gavroche. Then, becoming thoughtful, he muttered between his teeth, "All the same, if I had charge of the babes I'd lock 'em up better than that." Just as they were finishing their morsel of bread, and had reached the angle of that gloomy Rue des Ballets, at the other end of which the low and threatening wicket of La Force was visible. "Hello? Is that you, Gavroche?" said someone. "Hello? Is that you, Montparnasse?" said Gavroche. A man had just accosted the street urchin, and the man was no other than Montparnasse in disguise, with blue spectacles, but recognizable to Gavroche. "The beaux wows," went on Gavroche, "you've got to hide the color of a linseed plaster, and blue specs like a doctor. You're putting on style, 'pon my word." "Hush!" ejaculated Montparnasse, "not so loud." And he drew Gavroche hastily out of range of the lighted shops. The two little ones followed mechanically, holding each other by the hand. When they were ensconced under the arch of a porte-coquère, sheltered from the rain and from all eyes. "Do you know where I'm going?" demanded Montparnasse. "To the Abbey of Ascend with regret, 36, replied Gavroche. "Joker." And Montparnasse went on. "I'm going to find Babette." "Ah!" exclaimed Gavroche, "so her name is Babette." Montparnasse lowered his voice. "Not she, he." "Ah! Babette." "Yes, Babette. I thought he was buckled." "He has undone the buckle," replied Montparnasse. And he rapidly related to the gameman how, on the morning of that very day, Babette, having been transferred to La Conciergerie, had made his escape, by turning to the left instead of to the right in the police office. Gavroche expressed his admiration for this skill. "What a dentist!" he cried. Montparnasse added a few details as to Babet's flight, and ended with, "Oh, that's not all." Gavroche, as he listened, had seized a cane that Montparnasse held in his hand, and mechanically pulled at the upper part, and the blade of a dagger made its appearance. "Ah!" he exclaimed, pushing the dagger back in haste, "you have brought along your gendarme disguised as a bourgeois." Montparnasse winked. "The deuce," resumed Gavroche, "so you're going to have a bout with the bobbies?" "You can't tell," replied Montparnasse with an indifferent air. "It's always a good thing to have a pin about one." Gavroche persisted. "What are you up to tonight?" Again Montparnasse took a grave tone, and said, mouthing every syllable, "Things," and abruptly changing the conversation. "By the way, something happened t'other day. Fancy, I meet a bourgeois. He makes me a present of a sermon and his purse. I put it in my pocket.